This is Closereads,
a philosophy podcast with Mark and Wes.
I'm Wes Alwan.
And I'm Mark Linsenmeyer. We are continuing, though starting afresh. We had done 2 close read sessions on Max Scheler's Formalism and Ethics and Non-Formal Ethics of Value, on his notion of personhood, but it was deeply unsatisfying because I maybe started us at the wrong place. In this chapter 6, in part 2, Formalism and Person, on the theoretical concept of the person in general, and he was just talking about, I think, contrasting something with Kant's idea of the transcendental ego as being something that just has to be there to unify all of our experiences. Well, is that really what we mean by the thing that we have to respect as an end in itself? Is that what we have to call a person? And he just was moving so slowly that we went through person and reason, and part of section 2, person and the ego of transcendental apperception. And as those very abstract titles should tell you, we were not getting the juice that we wanted. So I had suggested we jump over to Edith Stein and read her account of personhood, which was more robust. We learned that persons are built out of emotions, out of acts of will. That's how we understand ourselves. That's how we understand another person. That's how we empathize with them. But apparently there is a International Scheler Society. Did you know about this, Wes?
Nope.
And someone from the International Scheler Society reached out to us and said, "Oh, you were almost there. Just read within that chapter 6, Formalism of Person, section 3, Person and Act, the psychophysical indifference of the person and concrete acts, essential levels of centrality within the person." That's the whole title of this.
This is going to clear everything up.
Yeah. So even though I realize this is going on the public feed, and a lot of people here didn't listen to part 2 because that was only on the supporter feed, that's fine. I think we can treat this hopefully like we're starting from scratch. We actually skipped a number of pages within section 2 right before this, just because we didn't want to. We were getting impatient. We're going on this guy's recommendation and getting down to business. But of course, if you want to hear that section 2 and you want to hear the sections subsequent to this that are not going to be on the public feed, then you want to make sure you are subscribed at patreon.com/closereadsphilosophy, and not merely getting this on the public feed. However, we're just grateful for any of you listeners and would love if you would go to wherever you're listening to this, to the Apple Podcast location for this. Give us a nice 5-star review. Do you have anything else to add by way of review or context, Wes, before we get into it?
Nope. I think I'm good.
Well, let's do it. We are up to, so this is page 382, or PDF page 415. Within that section 3, there's a subsection A, person and act. Please read, Wes.
Neither the being nor the problem of the person would exist if there were beings whose natural organization we set aside in the reduction, endowed with only knowing as thought and intuition, and those acts belonging to this, specifically theoretical sphere. Let us call such beings purely rational beings. Of course, these beings would still be logical subjects that execute rational acts, but they would not be persons, nor would they be persons if they had both inner and outer perception, and often dealt with knowledge of the soul and nature. That is, even if they found an object ego in themselves and others, and could perfectly observe, describe, and explicate experiences of the ego, as well as all individual egos. Sounds like God is not a person. The same would hold for beings whose entire contents were given only as projects of willing. They would be logical subjects of a willing, but not persons. For the person is precisely that unity which exists for acts of all possible essential differences, insofar as these acts are thought to be executed. Hence, by saying that it belongs to the nature of the differences of acts to be in a person and only in a person, we imply that the different logical subjects of essentially different acts, which are different only as otherwise identical subjects of such act differences, can only be in a form of unity insofar as we reflect on the possible being of these subjects and not merely on their nature, he said as he put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger.
All right, so I got a little lost toward the end of that. We can
I'm
read,
lost. I'm quite lost, but
but the beginning of it, that at least
yeah.
very much reminded me of what we just got out of Stein, that somehow mere perception is not enough to implicate the I. It does implicate in the Kantian sense that there must be, if there's a stream of experience, there must be some, we could group these together. Something distinguishes my stream of experiences from your stream of experiences, but that is not the robust I that we actually hook onto, say, in an act of love or empathy. We don't just love, oh, you are a container of of continuous or even non-continuous, but of a bunch of perceptions. That would not be enough. And yeah, so what do we think of putting aside the idea of will for a second there? Is this more convincing when Scheller says it than when Stein said it, or is it just as arbitrary and confusing?
Well, that makes sense. Purely rational beings endowed only with knowing are are not persons. Now, yeah, I'm waiting to find out specifically what it is that makes you a person. I guess it's going to be, well, it's not willing. Um, is it
Which I don't
feeling?
remember actually where Stein came down on that,
Well,
because that
something
was
to
the
do with feeling.
Stein definitely thought feeling implicated person, and then willing was the end of that part. And I
Hmm.
thought that willing also definitely did more to implicate a person than mere witnessing. That actually having a will, doing something, that was sort of in the category of emoting. That's right.
And
If I'm going
maybe
to
he's
love you or
gonna,
value you, then it could be because of the way you will, the way, because that also indicates a value in the same way that you're emotionally
right,
reacting to something, whereas witnessing does not.
right, okay, yeah. So we're on the track of valuing probably, and
Yep.
probably willing, even though he's gonna, this next session he's gonna say they would be the logical subjects of a willing but not persons. But maybe he's gonna get us to the point where there's some different relation to willing.
Well, let's see
Um,
what the sentence is that he says why it's not willing. For the person is precisely that unity which exists for acts of all possible essential differences, insofar as these acts are thought to be executed. What is
okay, let's
essential
look at the
possible?
let's look at the
Yeah.
footnote here. Therefore, a being which thinks itself, Aristotle's God, according to many interpreters, although not Friends Brentano, is not a person. Okay, ooh, so yeah, ring the bell for me.
Yep.
For self consciousness is not a person if, in this consciousness of itself, all possible kinds of conscious activities, knowing, willing, feeling, loving, and hating kinds, are not uniformly contained in it. Okay, so the supplemental stuff we're getting there is feeling, as we expected, loving, hating. Um, I mean, that sounds like saying, well, God is not, as a purely rational being, God is not a person because there's no feeling there,
Well,
right?
it doesn't relate to
Um,
other things, right? If it just thinks itself, then to feel at all, I think, is to be in relation to, right? I'm reacting to something, I'm feeling for something. It's not just like I'm just feeling joy about, there has to be an intentional object. And does
yeah,
if you're going to say that God is so complete that we have to define him as only relating to himself, because otherwise that would be a relation to a mortal, even would be like, oh, there's a reaching out like God in the picture, and there's an incompleteness. There's a thing that is not already in God that he has to relate to. Well, that would be less than perfect. This just seems to be something very idiosyncratic
Yeah.
about God. It doesn't say anything about a merely will. So I
Well,
was
this
already
is
also thinking
yeah.
robots, like a if we could set up as a perception, would that make a mind if we had, a memory bank that
Mhm.
is capturing perception after perception? Uh, no, but then if it can will, would that make a difference? Maybe. If it can feel, well, I just watched Andor, and that little robot was very upset when his owner died and was wanting her back, and so yes, that's a person.
Spoiler alert. No, well, this okay. So when he says a being which thinks itself, when I initially said God is not a person, I wasn't thinking specifically of an Aristotelian God, where God is just thought thinking itself, right? And he is, in a way, the good, right? In a way, that is just Aristotle's replacement for the good, and it's meant as a teleological explanation of all value, right? God becomes the grounds of value, and then the question is, can he have values? Which maybe, as the grounds of values, it wouldn't make sense to say he has values, and therefore it wouldn't make sense to say that he's a person. Uh, but more broadly within the tradition, even the Christian God as theologians, even neo-Aristotelian or Neoplatonic theologians might think of him, he's not just obviously thought thinking itself, he's omniscient. But then the question is, yes, once again, is there something effective there? And can value and willing, and this is, kind of reminiscent of what we're going to be talking about with Hume and PEL, can value and willing be divorced from the effective? Can it be divorced from willing? There's love, right? And God is supposed to be able to love, and God's love is apparently people are into that. Apparently religious people are into God's love. So I think, theologically people obviously want to say there's affect there, but how do you make sense of that in a perfect being? But in any case, for Scheler, it sounds like we're describing these perfectly rational beings devoid of affect, but I still don't understand this sentence. The person is precisely that unity which exists for acts of all possible essential differences. Acts of all possible essential differences. I mean, is maybe the implication here is that feeling is left out, and that's the problem. But hence, by saying that it belongs to the nature of the differences of acts to be in a person and only in a person, we imply that the different logical subjects of essentially different acts can only be in a form of unity insofar as we reflect on the possible being of these subjects, uh,
As
and
opposed to their
not
nature.
merely their.
So I think the differences seem like they are. I mean, it seems like he's still talking about synthesis here. So that, uh, right, you are a bundle of acts that are accessible only to your inner life. I'm a bundle of acts that's accessible only to my inner life. So there are all the essential differences insofar as these acts are thought to be executed. So there must be some essential difference between my willing or perceiving or whatever something and you're
Knowing,
doing
willing,
that.
feeling, loving, and hating. Those are the
Yes.
acts that he puts in the footnote. Yeah.
So even if we're both thinking of the number three, there is because my thought of that sort is coming from the locus of my being, and yours is coming from the locus of your being. That is an essential difference, even though we can't say what it is apart from how I just characterized it. Right? They're qualitatively the same, but they are quantitatively different because they are simply instances of different thoughts in different people.
Unity which exists for acts of all possible. Okay, the unity of all possible essential differences. I mean, is he talking about the unity of these different kinds of acts? How do we unite knowing, willing, feeling in
I mean,
one
that's what we've been
subject?
talking about to this point, so it would seem so.
Yeah. Okay. Um,
It belongs to the nature of the differences of act to be a person, to be in a person and only in a person, right?
okay. So then, yeah, we can say we can do this container thing, which you were talking about, and say, okay, they're unified in the sense they're just in the same bucket, right? As the logical subject. And that seems to be what he's objecting to. Um, that's the idea that there's a unity only in the being of these subjects, right? It's contingent. It's just a container, and not merely in their nature. So it sounds like he wants to ground that unity in something deeper, right? There's some essential, there's some essence maybe which can unite these disparate acts together, something like that. It's not just that they're all in a bucket together. Hey, here's these radically different things: willing, loving, knowing. But anyway, we'll see if that's the case.
Yep. Let's just keep going. We can now enunciate the essential definition in the above sense. The person is the concrete and essential unity of being of acts of different essences, which in itself, and therefore not, what's the Greek?
Not for another, I think.
That would make sense, and therefore not for another, precedes all essential act differences, especially the difference between inner and outer perception, inner and outer willing, inner and outer feeling, loving and hating, etc. The being of the person is therefore the foundation of all essentially different acts.
Sorry, that's for us, actually, literally for us. So in itself, and therefore not for us. So not uh yeah, just subjective as opposed
Yeah.
to thing in itself. All right. So the person is a concrete and essential unity, precedes all essential act differences. The being of this person is therefore the foundation of all essentially different acts. I thought he was saying he didn't like the being of these subjects as the foundation. In any
See, I thought
case,
I thought he
yeah.
was that it was the being and not as opposed to the nature. The nature is like that it is thinking of the
Okay.
number three, right? He had said
Okay.
for the person is precisely that unity which exists for acts of all possible essential differences. And, yeah.
Can only be in a form of unity insofar as we reflect on the possible being of these subjects and not merely on their nature.
And being in quotes actually seems important there, that this is a kind of a Heideggerian thought that they are acting, they are being in motion, they're something about not merely existence. Being does
Well,
not
so
just mean
now it sounds like
existence.
he's grounding the unity not in the nature of subjects, but in the being of subjects. The
Yes.
foundation,
So we don't know what that really means yet.
we don't know what it means. The person is the concrete and essential unity of being of acts of different. So I don't know. Yeah, we do get this idea of these things different, all these different acts being anchored in a concrete, essential, person with a nature, with an essence.
Right. So not merely a container, it is a being.
Hmm.
It has being.
Okay. All right. Shall I just read this one
Sure.
sentence?
Well,
Uh,
just yeah. And the one sentence and continue.
yeah. I know. But all of this depends on a correct understanding of the relation which we call foundation. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Above all, it must be made clear that in all investigations of acts made in pure phenomenology, we are concerned with genuine intuitive essences, never with empirical abstractions, which always presuppose the intuition of such essences, in that these essences delineate the possible scope of the inductive abstraction of possible common characteristics. Nevertheless, in all act investigations, we are concerned with abstract intuitive essences. And I think I should just read the
Yeah, read the
footnote because it
footnote.
seems to have an example. Um, a nuance of red on the surface of a cloth, for example, is truly intuitable. And as this nuance, it is also individual. That is, it is not individual because of the complex it enters into, but at the same time, it is something abstract belonging to the concretum of this surface. All right. Nevertheless, okay, these are abstract not only because they have been abstracted, but because they require supplementation insofar as they are to be. As opposed to abstract essences, concrete essences are a second kind of genuine intuitive essences.
To the footnote.
Just because something is concrete does not mean that it is real. Thus, the number three is a single concrete instance, but ideal and not real, insofar as it functions neither as a quantity nor as an ordinal number, fulfilling all possible equations, which I'm not going to list. 4 minus 1 equals x, etc. The possible fulfillments of the 3s,
The threes.
sorry, the threes meant in such equations represent only abstracta of this concrete three. So you can use different equations like 4 minus 1, 2 plus 1 to represent 3. Those are different abstracta of the concrete three. If an act essence is to be concrete, it is full intuitive. Its full intuitable givenness presupposes a reference to the essence of the person who is the executor of acts. Okay.
One
Wow.
more footnote there.
Yeah. All right. One can also form classes of persons that lead to a more complete essential cognition of the acts concerned, which cognition is completed in the cognition of the personal individual who executed an act. All
Not
right.
helpful. Not
Yeah.
helpful.
This turned out to be not a helpful paragraph.
Well,
Um,
I mean, certainly that footnote about numbers is clearly hitting on something that's probably discussed in Husserl or perhaps earlier in Scheller's work ad nauseum. I bet that there is something in the Husserl's logical investigations that is distinguishing the concrete, the number three, from its various abstractions uh, as used in various equations. It functions neither, it is a single concrete existence, though ideal, not real, insofar as it
well,
functions neither as a
yeah.
quantity nor as an ordinal
I
number
mean, a
fulfilling all
Platonist
possible
would say it's
equations.
ideal and real. I don't. The contrast between ideal and not and real confuses me here. Um,
Isn't that because within the phenomenological reduction, we don't want to say real means is in the ontology, is it? But we clearly even we're still allowed to recognize a mirage as a mirage within the phenomenological reduction, right? We don't
mhm.
say, "Well, I'm not saying anything about its reality." We're not saying about anything about its ultimate metaphysical status, but just within appearance, we recognize some things as illusions and some things as real. That's what I think real means there.
Okay.
Mere abstract numbers are not physical, certainly. So
Okay.
that's probably
Sure.
all we need.
Um, okay. Makes sense. Essences delineate the possible scope of the inductive. This kind of idea that we intuit essences that that somehow guide our inductive behavior, our ability to abstract. That's intuitively plausible to me. So, for instance, we don't just group, um, you know, dogs together based on, um, induction from various properties. I've already said this on various episodes. I think you grasp a dog, as a type, as a natural kind or a quasi natural kind. Um, Intuitively, you grasp an essence, or as Kripke would say, you do a, yeah, you get you. fix it, right? And whatever it turns out to be, you could figure that out more by investigation. But there's it starts with an intuition, and then you can do abstraction on top of that. I don't know if I'm right about that interpretation here, but if so, how does that apply? I mean, do you have a different reading of that?
I was trying to just think about this abstract intuitive essences where he uses a nuance of red on the surface of a cloth, for instance, so that, yeah, it's not just the concept of dog as an essence over various dogs, but even an individual
Mm-hmm.
can be an essence. It almost seems like, would it be accurate to say for Husserl and Scheler here that anything that you can intuit is an essence? I thought that was kind of what we, for our actual Husserl close reading, maybe something that we got out of it, that once you do the phenomenological reduction, then we're only looking for essences. I don't completely know what that means. That red dot here is an essence, as opposed to what? I mean, as opposed
Well,
to
you're saying it's
something that we're.
something abstract, it's intuitable, it's
Mhm.
individual. So it sounds like a trope in a way.
Yes.
Um, it's not individual just because it's instantiated, right? It's not like, okay, we have the universal and it becomes an individual by getting instantiated in an individual object. That seems to be what he's saying here. Um, but it is still, nevertheless, something abstract belonging to the concretum of this surface. So that I don't get that. It seems like you have to choose, right? And on my view, you have to say this is a trope, an individual trope in a concrete object, or and right, it's an individual in its own right, or it's a universal getting instantiated and therefore having its abstractness liquidated in its association with an individual object. Like, what's the in between? He's trying to have his cake and eat it too. It's an abstract belonging to the concretum. Um,
I think it's abstract just because we're picking out something from the flow, right? I'm sort of thinking about Bergson here, who's providing a foundation for Husserl, that what is, we have the flow of experience, and that is the concretum. And he says a nuance of red on the surface of the cloth. So it's not even red point here. It's something, what is the nuance? Like something about how the light is flickering over. So something we can't even put into words, but yet we can intuit it, we can grasp it as an individual thing. Clearly, just the fact that we're focusing our attention on that individual thing is pulling it out, is abstracting it from the flow, or the object that is the cloth. I mean, is that what he means by abstraction here? They're
yeah,
abstract
it's
not because they have been abstracted, but because they require supplementation insofar as they are to be. So, yeah, do we consider that little nuance as being in itself? No, it exists as part of the cloth.
they require supplementation insofar as they're to be. What does that mean? Supplementation?
I mean, what? Yeah, is
What are we
everything?
supplementing there? What are we
Well, this is again, we're trying to figure out what he means by being, and can any little blip that we could pick out have being? If being is not just that it exists in our visual field or exists in our phenomenal field, but it has some sort of robust existence as an entity, then yeah, we don't pick it. This is just about that there are essential ways that we pick objects out. It is not merely that there is this flow of experience and we arbitrarily, according to whatever scheme we want, pick things out. There really are essences that are findable in things, and this piece of cloth is an essence, whereas this little dot on the piece of cloth is not. It requires supplementation to be. That's the guess.
Yeah. All right. As opposed to abstract essences, concrete essences are a second kind of genuine intuitive essences. All right. So this is the upshot, is that we have these concrete essences. Um, and we don't just have abstract essences. That's fine. It sounds a little bit like Aristotelian immanent essences, right? And individual essences as opposed to just essences in Platonic forms. But if an act essence is to be concrete, and so an act essence meaning the essence of a act of loving or thinking or whatever,
Yep.
its fully intuitable givenness presupposes reference to the essence of the person who is the executor of the acts. Okay, so this is, we've already guessed this several times that he's going to want to anchor the unity of these acts, and I guess now he's anchoring their essences or their concreteness, let's just say. Their concreteness must be anchored in the essence of a person. So again, not just all belonging in a bucket,
Yep.
but anchored. You can make sense of it just metaphorically with this idea of anchoring, let's say. And when we think of the word concrete, we just think, okay, yeah, it's like um it's not a hollow sphere. It's like it's filled up with stuff. I can touch it. It's not an abstract circle. It's a little sphere that I can hold in my hands. It's concrete and it's full of stuff. And then I can drill into it and anchor all my acts in it as opposed to just dumping them in like a bunch of Legos in a container.
Right. And I think Stein gave us at least one way that these could be stuck together and not merely dumped in as a bucket, that they form a motivation complex, that they say something about the person's values
Hmm.
and not just that it is a receiver of data, as with the electronic eye.
Hmm.
And
All
I
right.
think it's you next. Yep.
Yeah. Or
Or no, it's not, because you were
it's
reading all
you.
his
It
footnotes.
is you.
From,
Yeah, yeah.
from this, it clearly follows that the person can never be reduced to the X of a mere point of departure of acts, or to some kind of mere interconnective complex or network of acts, as a form of the so-called actualistic theories, which conceives of the being of the person in terms of his doings. Ex operati sequitur esse would have it. The person is not an empty point of departure of acts, he is rather a concrete being. Unless we keep this in mind, all of our talk about acts can never catch the fully adequate essence of any act, but only an abstract essence. Abstract act essences concretize into concrete act essences only by belonging to the essence of this or that individual person. Therefore, a concrete act can never be fully and adequately comprehended without the antecedent intending of the essence of the person. Any interconnective complex will remain a mere complex of abstract act essences if the person himself, in whom such an interconnective complex exists, is not given. I guess let's look at the footnote. A theory of acts which neglects this turns the person into a mosaic of acts, and so arrives at another version of the atomistic conception of the mind, a version similar to that of association psychology. Sure.
Okay. So like Hume again, yeah. All these associated ideas are just in a bucket together.
Yep.
Yeah.
Of course, the actualistic theory is correct to maintain that the person is not a thing or substance which executes acts in the sense of a substance causality, for such things could in fact be randomly obliterated or exchanged. If there is a multiplicity, one thinks of Kant's picture of eclectic spheres, which are
Electric.
dynamic, electric spheres, which are dynamically unified. I'm not familiar with Kant's picture of electric spheres, spheres dynamically unified. Uh, things could be randomly obliterated or exchanged if there is a multiplicity with no change at all in immediate experience. In addition, everyone would carry the same substance with him, which, since every kind of manifold, for instance, time, space, number, plurality, would be missing, could not yield differences between one and the other. We got another long footnote. This was Spinoza's deep insight insofar as he broke away from the Cartesian theory of substance. Thus, soul substances became modes of the attribute thinking of a substance. Spinoza correctly saw that there is no place for the person in the presupposition that the mind's essence is only thinking. And he saw as well that the individualization of thinking beings would have to be shifted to mere differences among human bodies, as in the philosophy of Averroes. Thus, Spinoza drew correct conclusions from Descartes' false assumptions. Yeah, so we already know that Scheler does not like, oh, we're all underlyingly one, and that's this is
Yeah,
the
let's
whole
stop
point of talking
there
about this. Yeah,
because this is a very long paragraph actually, but let's just comment up to this point because
sure.
right, we're familiar with this sort of critique from Fichte to Kant, right? But it's the non-metaphysical version of the critique where the rational ego it's cannot be individuated, right? It's all just the same, and therefore we might as well just have one big God ego in which we all partake. That so I've never really thought of this, but that's a recapitulation of what Spinoza is doing on the level of substance ontology, where if on the Cartesian picture we are all just individual substances whose essence is thinking, then that naturally collapses into one big thinking essence. And then we are individuated spatiotemporally as modes of that
Yep.
one big substance. We become properties in a way. And that's the only way we can be individuated. So yeah, that's interesting. It never occurred to me that Fichte was just recapitulating that Spinozan critique.
Do you remember whether Leibnizian monads are themselves? Uh, I mean, they have to be different from each other, right? That
they're all substances.
there's
These
a
are all
plurality of
distinct
substances,
substances.
and
Yeah.
the only differences between them, right, is that because each one is a window of opening onto the entire world, right? Everything they contain like refractions. So it seems
Well,
like it's only that they're spatially.
they're windowless actually,
Oh, they're windowless monads.
and
So it's
they're like
God
it's
pre
like being
pre.
locked into a little theater that you can't get out of, and then God harmonizes what's on the screens, right? Because
Okay,
there's no causal
right.
interaction um, between monads. It's all linked by God. It's like a simulation in a way, but yeah.
So since Leibniz is famous for the identity of indiscernibles, are the monads, they must be discernible from each other, and it's not because they are in space next to each other because each one is windowless. They don't exist in an external space that holds all the monads in a nice row.
Well, I do think
Um,
I they
is
yeah.
that
Well, that's a good point. They do seem to exist in space time because he wants to explain matter in that way too, right? And the monads are really like atoms, but they're spiritual atoms, but they are also literally atoms.
all right? I'm just gonna set this aside because this is a text I do not remember, and I need to go re-listen to that episode and see if we want to close read some of it because that would be
Yeah,
fun.
but that would be fun. But yeah, in any case, here, what we're
Yep.
getting at is the idea. Well, we've seen that he wants concreteness in a person to anchor all these intentional acts, but he wants to have that concreteness, right? And I was literally thinking of a concrete sphere where you can just like drill into it and anchor things, which sounds a lot like substance, right?
Mm.
And saying there's stuff in there, but he wants to warn us and say, no, I don't want substance stuff. I don't want to do substance ontology. That's not what I'm getting at. Um, so then how do we do it? How do we unite these things if we're not doing substance ontology?
Uh, I guess we'll have to go on and see.
Um, okay.
So
Yeah,
start
let's
with
do that.
the last
The
sentence on
conclusion. Yep.
384 here. Yep.
The conclusion that the person must be only an interconnective complex of acts, even if only the intentional interconnection of meaning is quite false. All right. Again, that's like the bucket theory. Footnote 21. Needless to say, there is no causal relationship here, for the latter exists only for real correlates of experience, of what is given in inner perception. All right, forget about that. Surely, surely the person is and experiences himself only as a being that executes acts. He is in no sense behind or above acts, or something standing above the execution and processes of acts like a point at rest. For all of this is a picture taken from a spatio-temporal sphere, right? And it stands to reason that this does not hold for the relation between persons and acts. So we don't want these spatial metaphors that I was trying to use with spheres and things like that. This picture always leads to a substantialization of the person. Pictures of this kind also lead to questions characteristic of the 17th century, whether the soul always thinks, whether it executes acts even in a dreamless sleep, etc., whether it remains unchanged throughout life. All right. Um, so always leads to substantialization of the person, but the whole person is contained in every fully concrete act. All right, now we're getting to it. And the whole person varies in and through every act without being exhausted in his being in any of these acts and without changing like a thing in time. Okay, I'll just read a little more. But this concept of variation is as a pure becoming different, sorry, as a pure becoming different implies no time that makes change possible, nor does it imply a fortiori anything like changes. Nor is anything given here of a succession in this
Succession.
becoming,
Yep.
sorry, in this becoming different. We can comprehend succession without comprehending a change and without comprehending a thing like arrangement of a given material. For example, succession in the phenomenon of oscillation. Hey, I was wanted to say oscillation, but then I did the mark pronunciation double check. Um, Okay, succession is oscillation. And for this very reason, there is no necessity for an enduring being that subsists in the succession in order to safeguard the identity of an individual person. Identity lies solely in the qualitative direction of this pure becoming different.
All right, we might as well stop there because it
Let's
just
stop
keeps going,
there.
goes and goes.
And
Oh my God, it goes like the whole next page. So without
yeah.
without an ending paragraph.
All right, so let's
So this is interesting.
unpack that. Yeah, this is a complicated idea. We don't want to anchor things in a substance. So how are we gonna do it?
Right. We've seen different distinctions of modes. I'm just thinking like Schopenhauer's fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, that you might think, well, everything is causal, but no, the relation between the premises to the conclusion of an argument is not causal. Like it's successive in an interesting way, and likewise, uh, one of Schopenhauer's things it was a separate category for motivation, so that the way in which uh, motives motivate an action, or the way in which persons motivate actions, which is exactly what we're talking about here, is not causal. It is fundamentally different when you're doing phenomenology, at least, to talk about causality, which is a physical thing, and this relation of persons to actions. And so we don't want to import that physical picture of there is a substance that is the me, the self, that then does stuff. It has properties. It performs actions. No, so yeah, what is the alternative? It seems like it is something that shows itself through the actions. It's the actions, but taken with a different conceptual cast to them, or something like that.
Yeah, well, the reason, just for listeners, the reason we're suddenly talking about time and variation is that the substance is supposed to be the thing that underlies change. And we were thinking, in the metaphor we were thinking about earlier, we were thinking about statically, not temporarily, about a bunch of different acts being anchored in the same substance. But what's really going on is we have intentional acts in succession. You know, we love something and then we see something, we think something, we hate something. Maybe there's some simultaneity, but you get the picture. We're successively executing acts over time. And then the question is how these acts could be unified with each other, these things that are happening at different times. And it's not that they're just emanating from the same underlying substance. The whole person, he says, is contained in every fully concrete act. So that in my moment of loving, it's not just I'm just producing a partial property of the right, something like a mode or property of the whole substance underneath it. Um, you know, and that to have the whole person, I need to think about the entire succession of all acts of the person over time, all mental,
Hmm.
intentional acts.
You are not just your worst action. You are not just your best action. You are the stable thing that just happened to do that thing on that day. No, no, no. Actually, your whole person was displayed in that one act.
Yeah. And so we get, and this whole, instead of being a static, unchanging substance underneath the acts, varies in and through every act. So, which is weird, a weird thing to say, right? Because then what is the basis of personal identity? Why would we call it the same person if the whole person varies?
I mean, well, it's not
Um,
varies, it's varies in quotes. So it's not that
well,
it literally
yeah, well, he
changes.
says
It is,
without changing like a thing in time, right? He wants to say that this variation is actually not like a thing changing in time, but it's you're right. This it's quite paradoxical and confusing. The variation is right. It's not thing like change. We can think of a succession in terms of oscillation. There's no
we should not think of it in terms
oh,
of oscillation. We can comprehend succession without comprehending a change, without comprehending a thing-like arrangement of given material. For instance, succession in the phenomenon of oscillation.
I see.
I mean, I
All
just think of
right.
more thing-like metaphors. Like, okay, so a thing might be constantly turning you and showing you its different sides. I like that. That you did a mean thing yesterday, you did a nice thing yesterday. Those were just you were showing off your different sides. Yes, you were there as a full being in both of those acts, but they just did not appear the same to the outside observer. But that still would be calling you a thing.
I mean, the last sentence that we read, identity lies solely in the qualitative direction of this pure becoming different. This makes me want to use a physics metaphor and like draw a vector, right? And say the successive acts are, it's not that they are in the same substance, but they're in on the same vector, which still is, you know, it's intriguing, but still quite confusing to me.
Well, it's yeah, it still sounds Humean, right? For Hume, there really is no self, but what we would call a self, just like what we call causality is just a sequence of events, is this sequence, of our experiences. So I point at that association, but what if we don't want to say it's mere associationism, which implies that there's just could be any arbitrary string of things, but that there is an internal logic to it, so that there's a vector, a telos, a qualitative direction, and that's the thing that's being picked out, even when you're just identifying yourself as your own stream of consciousness. You're not just
Oh,
saying this thought, this thought, this thought, like, and you're not positing there's an object that's having all the thoughts that's behind the thoughts, but it's something in between there.
yeah, that's helpful because this is the way, right? This teleological unity is the way Aristotle wants to describe essential unity, right? That's the whole point of the unmoved mover of thought thinking itself. It's a foundation for teleology, and other things are moved towards it because they want to become good. like it, or they want
Hmm.
to fulfill their telos. So if we can, maybe this is, yeah, something on analogy to that, where we think of these uh, different acts as organized around uh, telos, although he's calling it qualitative direction. It's a pure becoming different, right? The whole person changes in each act without changing. The whole person, quote unquote, varies. Let's just be, yeah, specific, without changing like a thing in time. Um, and I suppose that you could think of that variation as okay. I, the upshot is we have to think of the unity is not a thing like underlying substantial thing, but something to do with this qualitative direction. And perhaps telos is a good analogy, perhaps not.
All right, just continuing that same paragraph then. In trying to bring this most hidden of all phenomena to givenness, we can guide the reader to the direction of the phenomenon only by way of images. Why do we think this is a hidden phenomenon? Like the identity of the individual person, the fact that we
Well, the
identify ourselves and other people as being the same person over time. Why does he think that's hidden? Is it because
well
the
the I
yeah.
is mysterious, right? And I mean, Kant wants to say it's transcendental. It's not even
Hmm.
given in experience.
All right. So clearly when I do that for other people, I do that because it's the same body. Or I'm assuming, or I'm using the argument of analogy or something, or at least that's what it seems like if I was trying to be very concrete about this. But he wants to say, no, phenomenologically, something very, very quick and more complicated is happening, and maybe that's why it's hidden. Is because it's so close to us that we're doing it all the time. I don't know. Let's keep going though. Uh, Thus, we can say that the person lives into time and executes his acts into time in becoming different. But the person does not live within phenomenal time, which is immediately given in the flow of inwardly perceived psychic processes, nor does he live in the objective time of physics. In the latter, there is nothing like fast and slow. Endurance, which figures here only as a limiting case of succession. It's looking how long this. Well, let's go back to the footnote later. Endurance or the phenomenal time dimensions of present, past, and future becomes the past and future points of phenomenal time are treated as possible points of the present. Oh my God. Because the
Because
person,
the past, yeah, because the past and future points.
yeah,
Okay.
because the person lives his existence precisely in the experiencing of his possible experiences, it makes no sense to try and grasp the person in past lived experiences. As long as we look only at the so called experiences and not at their being experienced, the person remains completely transcendent. But every experiencing, or as we can also say, every concrete act, contains all act essences that can be distinguished in phenomenological investigations. It contains them according to a priori orders of foundation, which are established by the results concerning act founding.
All right. Maybe stop there.
Yeah. Let me throw in the footnote there. So he had been talking about uh, endurance time. Okay, so he physical time versus perceived time versus whatever this time is. Footnote 23. Objective time is deformed and dequalified phenomenal time, whereas duration and succession within phenomenal time are positive qualities. Duration in objective time consists only in successive phases of the being of an object in which the object does not change. Although there is no present in objective time, since there is neither past nor future, a distinction which is relative to a lived body, present points of phenomenal time, and these exclusively, do correspond to points of objective time. This just seems like warmed over Bergson.
Hmm.
Um, all right, so yeah, what do we want to say about this section as a whole here?
All right. So we had gotten done with the identity as qualitative direction, and now we're on to right this most hidden of all phenomena. We want to bring it to givenness. You want to make it and to really, I think, understand its concreteness.
Hmm.
Um, and then to do that, we'll have to use images. All right. One of the images is the person living into time. Yeah, I don't know what that means. I mean, it kind of captures this idea of a vector, a qualitative direction, I suppose.
I mean,
Um,
I guess I like the as
all right.
opposed to living in time, which like as time is the container and we are objects sitting in the container. No, we are transcendent objects spurting our actions into time, which is kind of like how God must interact. If God is going to part the Red Sea, well, God exists beyond space and time. He must be somehow spurting his actions into time and parting that sea, or having sex with Mary or
Spurting.
whatever.
Great. Um,
Yes.
well, it does. It sounds like the having, of projects for existentialists or
Hmm.
values in a way project forward into time. I will get this. I will
Yeah.
have that, and maybe that's the point here.
Yes, he says that explicitly a little later, right?
Okay.
Lower in this paragraph, that our relation to the future, like that contains our experience, or experiencing, as opposed to when we think about the past. Well, we're making that past I into an object that is the focus of. Maybe I'm reading Stein into Scheler here, but at least that was Stein's take on it. Is that we externalize the past I, but that's not the same as with the future I. That's actually
So the
imminent in what we're doing.
yeah. So the person is not what's in either phenomenal time or objective time. Your body is the objective time of physics. Um, maybe you could say your empirical ego is in phenomenal time. The Humean self, in a way, is in phenomenal time. The succession of states, but Scheller's person, quote unquote, person, is is going to be different from that. I don't want to say transcend that because he doesn't want it to be transcendent, right? He wants it to be concrete. Once again, it sounds like it is the valuing projection forward into the future, maybe. Although that might be saying, reading a little too much into it, but um, there's nothing like fast and slow, endurance. He's going to say these things about objective time, okay,
Yep.
and phenomenal time. I don't think it's that important to nail that down. Yeah, so the person lives his existence precisely in the experiencing of his possible experiences. No sense of trying to grasp the person in past lived experiences. So it does really sound like the future is the focus. Um, if you conceive of the future, right, in a way, temporality is to be understood in terms of values, I think, and not the other way around. We understand futureness in terms of what lies at the end of these vectors of this qualitative directedness. If we didn't have values and willings and forward pointing intentional acts, we wouldn't there wouldn't be futurity. There
Sure.
wouldn't be a future. Yeah. All right.
Shall we
So
finish?
I guess I'll read the rest of this.
Yep.
Right. I think you just read. But every experiencing, or as we can also say, every concrete act, contains all act essences that can be distinguished in phenomenological investigations. It contains them according to a priori orders of foundation, which are established by the results concerning act founding. Therefore, every concrete act always contains inner and outer perception, lived body consciousness, loving and hating, feeling and preferring, willing and not willing, judging, remembering, representing, etc. Just fill in the rest for yourselves. All these divisions, necessary as they are, yield only abstract traits of the concrete act of the person if we are looking at the person. The concrete act of the person can be understood as a mere sum or a mere construct of such abstract act essences, no more than the person can be understood as a mere interconnective complex of acts. So cannot be understood that way. Rather, it is the person himself living in each of his acts who permeates every act with his peculiar character. Okay, so that's interesting, this concept of character. No knowledge of the nature of love, for instance, or of the nature of judgment can bring us one step nearer to the knowledge of how person A loves or judges person B. Nor can a reference to the contents, values, states of affairs, given in each of these acts furnish this knowledge. But, on the other hand, a glance at the person himself and his essence immediately yields a peculiarity for every act that we know him to execute, and the knowledge of his world yields a peculiarity for the contents of his acts. Suddenly, it sounds like what's individuating the person is character. We all have our personalities, in other words.
So I've gotten rather swept up in just how to wrap this up, which is, oh, he's doing another. Whereas I accused Stein in the bulk of her book as doing a prefiguring Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception, here I feel like he is prefiguring in the rest of this section, which has many more parts than this part A that we have read here, is redoing Heidegger's Being in Time. That, we're looking for this thing that's not a substance and it exists in its own subjective time, not in objective time that science uses. Well, it projects its future. This is Dasein. This is, it seems like yes, we could try to figure out exactly how he differs from Heidegger, what Heidegger, who I'm sure was familiar with this text, not just going straight off of Husserl, are they both ripping off Husserl very closely? I'm not sure. To how is he exactly changing? So the next section, the being of the person is never an object. So it seems we just said this. The psychophysical indifference of the person and his acts, the relation of the person to consciousness, in quotes. So these are all parts of the same title there. C, person and world. D, microcosm, macrocosm, and the idea of God, which is not quite Heidegger. E, lived body and environment. All right, so lived body and environment are not presupposed by distinction between psychic and physical. Ego and lived body. And G, non-formal a priori principles of explanatory psychology. All right, so that sounds more Husserlian. But so much of this, so I feel like I see where this is going enough that maybe we don't need a second part of this. But maybe can we see?
I'm done with I can't take this anymore. I mean, I enormous respect to Stein and Scheler, but I'm officially burnt out on this type of.
All right. Well, can we say a few more words? I'll actually focus on the words that you just read rather than how to wrap up here. The concrete act of the person can be understood as a mere sum or a mere construct of such abstract act essences, no more than the person can be understood as a mere interconnected complex of acts. Okay, I think we've already said that. Rather, it is the person himself living in each of these acts who permeates every act with his peculiar character. And you're trying to figure out, what does this character mean? Is it like Hume or somebody would consider character, like your dispositions to get mad at this thing and be faithful in this circumstance or whatever? Or is it
empirical personality?
Yes.
Is it something more abstract? Yeah.
Or is peculiar character just a way of saying that there's some different tone that each of ourselves has, not necessarily that I can enunciate it by like, well, this is your character. Are you being true to your character? If we just
is it our numerical distinctness, right? We're all
Hmm.
characterological clones, suppose, right? We're
Yep.
all exactly alike, but is that numerical distinctness the foundation of what he calls quote unquote peculiar character? Or would there be something about our qualitative differences that would enter into this? And obviously he wants to think there are qualitative differences between persons because he doesn't like the collapse right into the Spinoza substance or into God substance. We got to prevent collapse into God substance. And so it sounds like we need to be able to qualitatively distinguish persons by their characters. So I don't think it can just be numerical distinctness. That would be the empty subject, as a
No,
container. Um,
because we clearly are epistemologically, empathetically, sympathetically grasping onto something more specific than that. So he says, we can't just, if I want to know about Seth's love for his wife, just to use people who are not on the call with us, we can't just, the two of us talk about the nature of love. We have to be in that situation. We have to know something about, but if we just know Seth, we can kind of imagine what kind of husband he is. Like from the little interaction we've seen between him and his wife, we can know quite a lot about his peculiar character.
yeah.
All right, so there's something specific about people, yet we can't nail it down in the way that we respect them, what makes them, a universe unto themselves, what makes them a worthy moral target for a Kantian sort of morality or a sympathy-based morality. Um, so sure, let's move on with that in mind. And thanks for listening. Thanks for participating here. We love you.
All right. Thank you.